Hey everyone, welcome back to Beast History. Today we're diving into a story about a monster. But this isn't a creature with claws and fangs. This monster was born from progress, fed by wealth, and lived in the heart of the most powerful city on Earth. It was a monster of pure, concentrated filth, and its name, whispered in the halls of power and cursed in the streets, was the Great Stink. We're going to Victorian London, the capital of an empire on which the sun never set, a city that was, in the summer of 1858, literally choking to death on its own success. This isn't just a story about a bad smell. This is the story of how an unbearable, city-killing stench, a series of terrifying plagues, and a bitter war between brilliant minds forced a paralyzed government to build one of the most magnificent engineering wonders of the modern world. A hidden subterranean colossus that you've probably never heard of, but one that saved millions of lives and created the blueprint for the very cities we live in today. It's a story of how humanity, when pushed to the absolute brink, sometimes creates its greatest triumphs out of sheer, panicked desperation. Let's get one thing straight. Mid-19th century London was, by any measure, the center of the known universe. It was the New York, the Tokyo, and the Silicon Valley of its day, all rolled into one sprawling, smoke-belching metropolis. The Industrial Revolution had turned Britain into the world's workshop, and London was its corporate headquarters, its trading floor, and its shipping department. The wealth flowing through its docks was staggering. Its banks financed wars and railways on every continent. Its navy ruled the waves with an iron fist. From the outside, London was a shimmering monument to human achievement, a city of dazzling new technologies, grand architecture, and immense power. Charles Dickens called it a magic lantern, projecting its wonders across the globe. But if you scratched that glittering surface, if you stepped off the grand avenues and into the labyrinth of alleys and courts, where most of its 2.5 million residents actually lived, you found a very different reality. You found the dark underbelly of progress. And the first thing that would hit you, long before the sights and sounds, would be the smell. It was a complex, layered, and utterly inescapable assault on the senses. It was the metallic tang of coal smoke from a million chimneys, hanging in a perpetual, yellow-brown fog that stained buildings black and burned the back of your throat. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, crammed by the dozen into single, unventilated rooms. It was the reek of horse manure from the thousands of animals that served as the city's engines, their waste slicking the cobblestones. It was the scent of rot from the overflowing churchyard burial pits, so full that the dead were practically bursting back into the world of the living. But rising above all of that, unifying it into one monstrous symphony of stench, was the smell of the city's central artery, its most celebrated feature, the River Thames. The majestic river that poets had praised for centuries, the river that flowed past the brand new houses of Parliament and the royal palaces, was no longer a river. It was a sewer. An open, festering, 6-mile-long sewer, churning with the untreated, raw waste of every man, woman, and child in the largest city on the planet. In the summer heat, the water wasn't just brown, it was opaque. A thick, viscous soup of human excrement, industrial effluent, animal carcasses, and all the discarded refuse of a civilization that had grown too big, too fast. It was, as one newspaper put it, a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. So how did it get this bad? How did the capital of the world's greatest empire turn its most famous landmark into a public toilet? The answer is a perfect storm of good intentions, bad science, and the unforeseen consequences of innovation. It's a classic story of a problem that had been around for centuries suddenly colliding with modernity and exploding into a full-blown crisis. For most of its history, London, like every other city, had a simple, if unpleasant, way of dealing with human waste. If you were wealthy, you had a privy in your garden or a cesspool in your basement. A cesspool was essentially just a big, brick-lined tank buried in the ground. Everything you flushed, or more accurately, dumped, went into this tank and just sat there. It would slowly decompose, the liquid seeping out into the surrounding soil. When it got too full, you'd hire the night soil men. These were crews of workers who, under the cover of darkness, would come to your house, pump out the sludge from your cesspool, and cart it away to sell as fertilizer to farmers outside the city. It was a closed-loop system, in a way. The city's waste fed the countryside, which in turn fed the city. If you were poor, you probably shared a single, stinking outhouse with dozens of other families, or you just used a bucket and chucked its contents into the street gutter or the nearest ditch. It was gross, it was unsanitary, but for a city of a few 100,000 people, it was manageable. The system, for all its flaws, could more or less cope. Then, the 19th century happened. The Industrial Revolution hit London like a tidal wave. People poured in from the countryside looking for work. The population doubled, then tripled. The city exploded outwards in an uncontrolled sprawl of cheap, hastily built housing. Suddenly, those ancient cesspools were completely overwhelmed. There were too many people producing too much waste. Basements started flooding with sewage. The ground beneath London became a saturated sponge of human filth. The night soil men couldn't keep up, and the city's network of old streams and rivers, which had long been used as informal drains, were now carrying torrents of waste, turning into vile, black channels of sludge like the notorious River Fleet. And then came the final, fatal blow, an invention that on its face was a triumph of domestic comfort and cleanliness, a symbol of Victorian progress, the flush toilet. Invented in the late 18th century, but only becoming widespread among the middle and upper classes in the 1830s and 40s, the flush toilet seemed like a miracle. No more smelly privies. Just a clean, ceramic bowl and a pull of a chain, and your waste was magically whisked away. But where did it go? That was the question nobody had properly considered. The flush toilet used a tremendous amount of water compared to the old system. Instead of a few pounds of solid waste going into a cesspool, you now had gallons and gallons of sewage-laden water being produced with every flush. This massive new volume of liquid waste completely broke the cesspool system. They overflowed constantly. The smell in people's homes became unbearable. So, the city's engineers and planners, driven by a desire for cleanliness and a fear of foul air, made a fateful decision. They encouraged, and in some cases mandated, that homeowners connect their new flush toilets not to their cesspools, but to the existing network of street drains. This sounds logical, except for one catastrophic detail. Those drains were storm drains. They were never designed to carry sewage. They were built to carry rainwater off the streets, and crucially, they all emptied directly, without any form of treatment, straight into the River Thames. It's a perfect, tragic irony. The very device created to make individual homes cleaner and more pleasant was the instrument that poisoned the entire city. Every pull of the chain in a fashionable townhouse was another nail in the coffin of the river. By the 1850s, tens of thousands of homes were channeling their raw, untreated sewage directly into the Thames. The river that had been the city's source of drinking water, its main transport artery, and its prime recreational space was now the final destination for everything London wanted to get rid of. The scale of the pollution is almost impossible to comprehend. We're talking millions of gallons of raw sewage every single day. The ancient system wasn't just broken, it had been weaponized against the city itself. Now a stinking river is one thing, but what turned this environmental disaster into an existential crisis was fear. A deep, primal, and as it turns out, scientifically misguided fear. To understand the terror that gripped London, you have to understand the dominant medical theory of the day, the miasma theory. For us today, with our knowledge of germ theory, it's easy to dismiss it. But in the mid-19th century, miasma wasn't some fringe folk belief. It was the consensus of mainstream science. It was taught in the best medical schools and believed by the most brilliant minds. The theory was simple. Diseases, particularly epidemic diseases like cholera, typhus, and plague, were not spread by physical contact or contaminated substances. They were spread by miasma, which literally means pollution in Greek. Miasma was bad air. It was a poisonous, invisible vapor that rose from rotting organic matter, from swamps, from garbage pits, from open graves, and most terrifyingly from sewage. The smell itself was thought to be the disease. If you could smell rot and decay, you were breathing in the agent of death. And in a city like London, this theory made perfect sense. Where were the disease outbreaks always the worst? In the poorest, most crowded and smelliest slums. It seemed like a clear cause and effect. The fouler the air, the sicker the people. So when the River Thames began to smell not just bad but apocalyptically foul, it wasn't just an offense to the nose. It was, in the minds of Londoners, a ticking time bomb. They believed they were living on the edge of a great, stinking volcano of death, and that with every summer breeze that blew off the water, they were inhaling their own doom. And they had very good reason to be afraid, because a new killer had arrived in London, a disease so swift, so violent, and so mysterious that it seemed to be a divine punishment. Its name was cholera. Cholera was a new horror for the Western world. It had swept out of its homeland in the Indian subcontinent in the early 19th century and moved relentlessly across the globe. It arrived in London for the first time in 1832, and the city had no idea what hit it. The disease was terrifyingly fast. A perfectly healthy person could feel a slight stomach cramp in the morning and be dead by nightfall. It caused extreme diarrhea and vomiting, leading to such rapid dehydration that the victim's skin would turn blue and shrink against their bones. Their blood would thicken into a sludge, their features would sharpen, and they would die in agony, often conscious until the very end. It was a disease that turned a living person into a shrunken husk in a matter of hours. The first epidemic killed over 6,000 Londoners. Panic gripped the city. No one knew what caused it or how it spread. The authorities tried everything. They burned barrels of tar in the streets to purify the air. They fired cannons, believing the concussions would disperse the deadly miasma. None of it worked. The disease just scythed through the population, and then, just as mysteriously as it arrived, it faded away. It returned again in 1848, this time with even more ferocity, killing over 14,000 people. And again in 1853, claiming another 10,000 souls. Each epidemic was a citywide trauma. Business ground to a halt. People who could afford it fled to the countryside. Those who remained lived in a state of constant dread, sniffing the air for any unusual scent, downing useless patent medicines, and praying they wouldn't be next. And with each wave of death, the belief in the miasma theory only grew stronger. The Thames stank, and people were dying in horrific numbers. The connection seemed undeniable. The river wasn't just a disgrace, it was a murderer. This is the backdrop against which our main characters enter the stage. The crisis in London created a desperate need for solutions, and that call was answered by two men with two radically different ideas about the nature of the problem. They would become the central figures in the intellectual war for the city's future. One was a giant of the establishment, a man who would, with the best of intentions, make the problem infinitely worse. The other was a quiet outsider, a methodical genius who would solve the mystery, only to be ignored. First, let's meet the Titan, Edwin Chadwick. If you were to design a quintessential Victorian reformer, you would end up with a man like Chadwick. Born in 1800, he was a lawyer by training but a bureaucrat by soul. Chadwick was a force of nature. He was arrogant, he was obsessive, he was notoriously difficult to work with, but he was driven by a genuine and relentless passion to improve the lives of the poor. He was a central figure in the Poor Law Reform of 1834, and most importantly for our story, he became the absolute high priest of what was known as the sanitary movement. Chadwick was obsessed with statistics and data. He pioneered the use of detailed social surveys to document the appalling living conditions in Britain's new industrial cities. And in 1842, he published his masterpiece, a groundbreaking and hugely influential report called The Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population of Great Britain. It was a bombshell. In page after page of cold, hard data, he proved a direct link between filth, disease, and poverty. He showed that a laborer in a dirty industrial town had a life expectancy decades shorter than one in a cleaner, rural area. He argued compellingly that disease was not just a human tragedy, it was an economic disaster. Sickness created poverty, and poverty created a huge tax burden on the state. It was, he insisted, cheaper to keep people healthy than to let them get sick. It was a revolutionary idea. But Chadwick was a man of his time, and he was a devout, unshakable believer in the miasma theory. For him, the chain of causation was simple and absolute. Filth creates smell. Smell creates disease. Therefore, to prevent disease, you must eliminate the smell. His entire philosophy was based on this one, profoundly flawed premise. And he pursued it with the zeal of a crusader. His solution for London was what he called the arterial venous system. He envisioned flushing the city clean. He saw water mains as the arteries, bringing fresh, clean water in. And he saw the sewers as the veins, carrying all the foul, miasma-generating waste away. And where should these veins lead? To the great natural flushing mechanism of the River Thames. To Chadwick, this was a matter of urgent public health. The cesspools lingering in people's basements were stagnant pits of miasma. They had to be abolished. All waste had to be kept moving and diluted with water. He used his immense influence to push through legislation that forced the closure of cesspools and mandated that all homes be connected to the sewer system. You can see the terrible logic of it. He was trying to get the poison out of the houses. He just didn't realize he was concentrating all that poison in one place and creating a much larger public health bomb. Chadwick's policies, born from a desire to save lives, were directly responsible for the hyperpollution of the Thames. He was so convinced that the smell was the enemy that he couldn't see the real danger lurking in the water itself. He was a brilliant, dedicated man who was, unfortunately, brilliantly and dedicatedly wrong. And that brings us to our other protagonist, the man who was right, Dr. John Snow. John Snow was, in almost every way, the opposite of Edwin Chadwick. Where Chadwick was a loud political operator, Snow was a quiet, unassuming physician. He was born into a working-class family in York and had made his name as a pioneer in the new and controversial field of anesthesia. In fact, he was so respected that he personally administered chloroform to Queen Victoria during the birth of 2 of her children. But his true passion, the work that would define his legacy, was epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread. Snow was a skeptic. The miasma theory, with its vague notions of bad air, just didn't sit right with him. It was too imprecise. It didn't explain the strange patterns of cholera outbreaks. Why would a deadly cloud of miasma kill the residents of one house but spare the people living right next door? Why would it follow certain roads but not others? To Snow, it didn't add up. He had a different hypothesis. A radical and, at the time, deeply unpopular idea. He suspected that cholera was not an airborne disease at all. He believed it was a poison that was ingested, that entered the body through the mouth, and was spread through contaminated water or food. He first published his theory in 1849, and he was almost universally ignored. The medical establishment was completely invested in the miasma model. Snow's idea seemed absurd. If the cholera poison was in the water, wouldn't everyone who drank from the Thames be dead? They dismissed him as a crank, but Snow was persistent. He was a detective at heart, and he was waiting for a case that would allow him to prove his theory beyond all doubt. In August of 1854, he got his chance. Cholera struck the London neighborhood of Soho with breathtaking speed and ferocity. In the space of just 10 days, Over 500 people died in an area of just a few square blocks. It was a perfect, horrifying case study. The miasma theorists pointed to a foul sewer smell in the area as the obvious culprit, but Snow saw his opportunity. He went to Soho, and he began to investigate, not with grand theories, but with shoe leather and a notebook. He went door to door, methodically, painstakingly, recording every single death. He was creating something new, a map of the epidemic. He talked to the families of the victims. He asked them, "Where did you get your water?" As he collected his data, a stunning pattern began to emerge. The deaths were not random. They were clustered with terrifying precision around one specific public water pump on Broad Street. People who lived closer to other pumps, even just a block away, were largely spared. Snow dug deeper, and his investigation uncovered story after story that confirmed his suspicion. There was the case of a workhouse near the epicenter of the outbreak which had almost no cases of cholera. Why? Because, Snow discovered, the workhouse had its own private well and didn't use the Broad Street pump. He found a factory where hundreds of men worked, but only a handful got sick. He found that the factory also had its own well, but provided the workers with a daily allowance of beer, so they rarely drank water from the nearby pump. The most famous piece of evidence, the smoking gun, came from a woman who had died of cholera miles away in Hampstead, an area with no outbreak at all. This case completely baffled the miasma theorists. Why would she die? Snow investigated and discovered that this woman had grown up in Soho and had retained a fondness for the taste of the water from the Broad Street pump. She had a bottle of it delivered to her house in Hampstead every single day. Her and her visiting niece both drank the water. They both died. Armed with this overwhelming statistical evidence, Snow went to the local authorities, the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. He presented his map and his findings and made a simple, urgent request: remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. The board was skeptical. His theory still sounded bizarre to them. But the death toll was undeniable and they were desperate. They agreed to take the handle off, forcing residents to get their water elsewhere. And just like that, the Soho outbreak stopped. Snow later discovered the source of the contamination. A sick infant, living in a house right next to the pump, had its soiled diapers washed in water that was then dumped into an old, leaking cesspool just 3 feet away from the pump's well. The cholera pathogen had seeped through the soil and into the drinking water. It was the definitive proof. John Snow had solved the riddle of cholera. He had proven that it was a waterborne disease. It was one of the single greatest breakthroughs in the history of public health, and the medical and political establishment completely rejected it. They admitted his data was interesting, but they clung stubbornly to the miasma theory. The official government report on the Soho outbreak, led by a Chadwick acolyte, concluded that Snow's data was probably just a coincidence, and that the real cause was, you guessed it, a cloud of foul-smelling miasma that had conveniently settled over the Broad Street area. Snow's triumph was met with a wall of institutional arrogance and denial. The world had been handed the key to defeating one of its greatest killers, and it chose to leave it on the table. The official policy remained the same. Keep flushing everything into the Thames to get rid of the deadly smells. And this brings us to a really fascinating question about one of the key players in this drama. Edwin Chadwick dedicated his life to public health. He fought tirelessly for the poor and the sick. And yet, his most significant legacy was to champion a policy based on a wrong scientific theory that turned the Thames into a weapon and almost certainly made the cholera epidemics far, far worse. He was acting on the best scientific knowledge available to him, and with what seemed to be genuinely good intentions. So, considering he was acting on the accepted science of his day, is it fair to judge Edwin Chadwick as a villain in this story? Or was he a tragic, well-intentioned figure whose efforts simply backfired in a catastrophic way? What's your take on his legacy? Let me know in the comments. So by the mid-1850s, London was trapped in a perfect nightmare. The city was convinced that a deadly, invisible poison was rising from its own river, a river it had systematically murdered with its own waste, thanks in large part to the well-intentioned but disastrous policies of Edwin Chadwick. Meanwhile, the real solution, the waterborne theory proven by John Snow, was gathering dust, dismissed and ignored by the establishment. The city knew it had a crisis. It could smell it every single day. But it was paralyzed by a combination of scientific ignorance and political inertia. The problem seemed too big, too expensive, and too complex to solve. What London needed was a hero. Not a politician, not a scientist, but someone else entirely. It needed an engineer. It needed a man with a vision grand enough to match the scale of the disaster. That man was Joseph Bazalgette. Joseph Bazalgette is the central hero of our story, but he doesn't fit the typical heroic mold. He wasn't a charismatic leader or a revolutionary firebrand. He was a quiet, meticulous, and profoundly determined man of science and engineering. He was, in essence, a problem solver, and London had the biggest problem in the world. Bazalgette was born in 1819 in North London, the son of a retired Navy captain. He came from a family of French Protestant, or Huguenot, descent, who had fled to England to escape religious persecution. From a young age, he showed a remarkable aptitude for mathematics and drawing. Instead of a classical university education, he followed the path of many of the great 19th century engineers. He became an apprentice. He went to work under Sir John McNeill, a renowned engineer who was a specialist in the booming new field of railway construction. This was the crucible where Bazalgette's talent was forged. Building railways in the early 19th century was a brutal, demanding business. It required precise surveying, an intimate knowledge of geology and hydraulics, and the ability to manage huge, unruly gangs of laborers known as navvies. It was here that Bazalgette learned the nuts and bolts of large-scale civil engineering. He learned how to move tons of earth, how to build bridges and viaducts, how to cut tunnels through solid rock. He learned the practical, real-world skills that you couldn't get from a textbook. After his apprenticeship, he set up his own consulting practice in London. He was known for his incredible work ethic and his almost obsessive attention to detail. But his career and his life were almost cut short. While working on a project to reclaim land from the sea in Northern Ireland, he suffered a catastrophic nervous and physical breakdown. The official diagnosis was overwork, but it was a severe collapse. He was so ill that for an entire year he was unable to work. It was a harrowing experience, but it seems to have forged an iron resilience in him. When he finally recovered, he returned to his work with a renewed, almost relentless focus. He had faced his own mortality, and it had made him tougher. This was the man, practical, experienced, tough as nails, and possessing a deep understanding of infrastructure, who would be tasked with saving London from itself. But before he could build anything, he had to navigate a political landscape that was arguably more toxic and dysfunctional than the river itself. To understand the challenge facing Bazalgette, you have to picture mid-Victorian London not as a single, unified city, but as a chaotic mess of competing fiefdoms. It was a dysfunctional family of ancient and powerful jurisdictions. You had the City of London Corporation, the ancient, wealthy, and fiercely independent square mile at the heart of the city. Then you had dozens and dozens of other local authorities known as vestries and parish boards. Each one was responsible for its own little patch of the metropolis. They were in charge of paving, lighting, and crucially, the sewers in their area. Imagine trying to build a modern subway system in New York City, but instead of one transit authority, you had to get separate approval and funding from hundreds of different neighborhood associations, each with its own petty rivalries, its own budget, and its own power of veto. It was administrative anarchy. There was no central authority capable of planning or executing a project on the scale that London so desperately needed. The various commissions in charge of sewers were a joke. They were famously corrupt, incompetent, and more interested in political infighting than in solving the sanitation crisis. They would bicker for years over the course of a single sewer line. One famous story tells of a house that sat on the border of two different commissions. The residents had to endure sewage from one district flowing through their basement to reach the sewer of the other. It was a system perfectly designed to prevent anything from getting done. The cholera epidemics of the 1840s and 50s finally shocked the government into realizing that this chaos could not continue. The city's fragmented governance was a threat to public health and national security. So, in 1855, after years of debate and political horse trading, Parliament passed a landmark piece of legislation, the Metropolis Management Act. This act was a radical step. It swept away the patchwork of old commissions and, for the very first time, created a single, city-wide governing body for London. It was called the Metropolitan Board of Works. This new board was a strange beast. It was London's first real central government, but it was a deeply flawed one. Its members weren't directly elected by the public, but were instead delegates sent from the various local vestries. This meant it was still plagued by local rivalries and parish pump politics. The press mockingly called it the Metropolitan Board of Words because of its endless, tedious debates. It was underfunded, it was politically weak, and it was viewed with deep suspicion by a parliament that was hostile to the idea of a powerful, independent London government. But the Metropolitan Board of Works had one primary, overarching mandate. Its main reason for existing was to solve the sewer crisis. It was created to clean up the Thames, and to do that, it needed a chief engineer. After a competitive process, they chose the 46-year-old Joseph Bazalgette. It was the perfect marriage of man and moment. The city finally had an institution capable of tackling the problem, and that institution now had an engineer with the vision and skill to match. The stage was set. Bazalgette now had the platform to present his grand, audacious plan to save London. And what a plan it was. It was a work of breathtaking genius, not just in its engineering, but in its elegant simplicity. Bazalgette had looked at the problem and realized that all previous attempts had been focused on the wrong thing. They had been trying to find ways to treat or filter the sewage before it went into the Thames. They had been tinkering at the edges of the problem. Bazalgette's insight was to see that this was a losing battle. As long as the sewers of London emptied into the river within the confines of the city, London would be poisoned. The solution was not to clean the sewage. The solution was to get it the hell out of town. His plan was to completely replumb the entire city. He proposed to build a brand new secondary sewer system that would run completely independently of the old one. He called these new sewers interceptors. It's a brilliant name because it perfectly describes what they did. He planned to build 5 massive brick-lined tunnels, 3 on the north side of the Thames and 2 on the south. These tunnels would be constructed at a lower level than the existing sewers and would run parallel to the river, from west to east. The genius of the interceptor concept was that it would catch all the sewage from London's thousands of existing sewer lines before it could reach the river. Each of the old sewers that used to dump its foul contents into the Thames would now flow directly into one of Bazalgette's giant interceptor sewers. Gravity would do the rest. He meticulously designed the interceptors to have a gentle, continuous downward slope, a gradient of just 2 feet per mile. This was just enough of a slope to keep the contents flowing at a steady, self-cleaning velocity of about 2.5 miles per hour, but not so steep that it would cause erosion or require excessively deep and expensive tunneling. This network of interceptors would act like a new river system, a man-made, subterranean river of waste, flowing silently beneath the city streets. It would carry the collected sewage of all of London far to the east, miles downstream from the city center. On the north side, the outfall point would be at a place called Beckton. On the south side, at Crossness. Here, at these outfall points, huge reservoirs would hold the sewage. And then only on the high, outgoing tide would the sewage be released into the river, where the powerful ebb tide would carry it far out into the North Sea, away from the city's water supply. The plan was brilliant. It was elegant. It solved the problem completely, but its scale was almost beyond comprehension. This wasn't just a new sewer. This was the largest and most complex civil engineering project the world had ever seen. It would require 82 miles of massive new brick tunnels. To connect London's existing street sewers to these new interceptors, it would require building another 1,100 miles of new local sewers. It would involve excavating 3.5 million cubic yards of earth, right through the heart of the most densely populated city on the planet. It would require over 300 million bricks and nearly 1 million cubic yards of concrete, more than had ever been used in a single project before. It was, for its time, the equivalent of a moonshot. It was a project of immense ambition, staggering complexity, and, most controversially, astronomical cost. Bazalgette's initial estimate was that the whole thing would cost around £3 million. In today's money, that's a figure in the billions of dollars, and that is where the real fight began. Bazalgette, the engineer, had the solution, but now he had to become a politician and a warrior, because he was about to run headfirst into a wall of pure, stubborn, institutional no. The period from 1853, when Bazalgette first started developing his plans, to 1858 was one of deep and bitter frustration. It was a 5-year-long war of attrition. Bazalgette and the Metropolitan Board of Works were on one side. On the other side was the most powerful institution in the country, the British Parliament, and specifically Her Majesty's Treasury. The politicians in Westminster looked at Bazalgette's grand design with horror. The cost was one thing. £3 million was a sum that made even the wealthiest government in the world blanch, but it was also a question of power. Many in Parliament were deeply suspicious of the new Metropolitan Board of Works. They saw it as a potential rival, a new power center in London that could challenge the authority of the national government. The last thing they wanted to do was to hand this new, untested body a blank check for the most expensive public works project in history. The chief antagonist in the early days was a man named Sir Benjamin Hall. He was the first commissioner of works in the government, the minister responsible for overseeing public projects. He was also, ironically, the man for whom Big Ben is named. Hall fancied himself an expert on sewers. He took an instant dislike to Bazalgette's plan. He thought it was too grand, too expensive, and he had his own pet theories about how the sewer should be built. He subjected Bazalgette to a humiliating series of reviews and interrogations. He appointed committees of rival engineers to pick apart the plans. He constantly sent Bazalgette back to the drawing board, demanding that he make the sewers smaller, that he use cheaper materials, that he find a less ambitious, and therefore less effective, solution. Bazalgette's response to this was a masterclass in patient, strategic resistance. He never lost his cool. He calmly and methodically answered every objection. He produced mountains of data, charts, and calculations to defend his design. When they told him to make the sewers smaller, he demonstrated with painstaking mathematical proof that smaller sewers would simply clog up and fail. When they proposed different, cheaper routes, he produced detailed geological surveys showing why those routes were impractical. He fought them not with rhetoric, but with overwhelming, irrefutable engineering fact. He buried his opponents in data. One of the most contentious issues was the size of the sewer pipes. Many of the government's consulting engineers argued for smaller, egg-shaped sewers, which were cheaper to build. Bazalgette insisted on large, circular tunnels. He argued that the circular shape was structurally stronger, and crucially, that the large size was essential not just for carrying the sewage, but for allowing workers to access the tunnels for inspection and maintenance. He was designing a system that wasn't just meant to work on day one. He was designing a system that was meant to last for centuries. The political battle raged on for years. Plan after plan was submitted. Plan after plan was rejected or sent back for endless revisions. The newspapers were filled with angry letters and editorials. Some argued that the project was a colossal waste of money. Others, terrified by the miasma theory, argued that pumping all the city's sewage to one spot in the east would simply create a new, even more concentrated, plague marsh that would wipe out the population there. Rival engineers, smelling an opportunity to get the lucrative contract for themselves, publicly attacked Bazalgette's competence and vision. The whole saga is a perfect case study in how political short-sightedness and fiscal conservatism can paralyze progress, even in the face of an existential threat. The key figures in government at the time were men like William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. These were giants of Victorian politics, but they were also obsessed with balancing the budget. They viewed a project on this scale as fiscally reckless. They simply could not bring themselves to approve the expenditure. They were playing a game of chicken with a public health time bomb. They were gambling that the crisis wouldn't get that much worse, that some cheaper, easier solution would present itself. They were wrong. Throughout these years of frustration, Bazalgette remained steadfast. He must have been deeply frustrated, but he never showed it publicly. He just kept working, refining his plans, building his case, and waiting. He knew his plan was the only one that would work. He knew that, sooner or later, reality would force the politicians' hands. He had the right plan at the wrong time. All he could do was wait for the time to be right. He had no idea that his moment of vindication would come not in the form of a reasoned political debate, but in a wave of unbearable, gag-inducing, city-stopping stench. The summer of 1858 was coming, and with it, the great stink. By the spring of 1858, the situation in London had settled into a grim and frustrating stalemate. Joseph Bazalgette had his magnificent, life-saving plan locked and loaded, a detailed blueprint for the salvation of the city. But it was trapped in a political purgatory, held hostage by a parliament that was too cheap, too short-sighted, and too fragmented to act. For 5 long years, the arguments had gone back and forth, a tedious cycle of proposals and rejections, while the river at the city's heart grew filthier and more menacing with every passing day. The crisis was a slow-motion disaster, a problem that was easy for politicians to acknowledge in theory but postpone in practice. It would take something truly extraordinary, a force of nature, to break the deadlock. And in June of 1858, that force arrived. It wasn't a flood or an earthquake. It was a heat wave. The summer of 1858 started early, and it started hot. Day after day, a relentless sun beat down on the city from a cloudless sky. For weeks, there was barely a drop of rain. In a normal city, this would be an inconvenience, a cause for complaint. In mid-19th century London, it was the trigger for a catastrophe. The sustained heat and drought had 2 devastating effects on the River Thames. First, with no fresh rainwater to replenish it, the river's flow slowed to a sluggish crawl. The mighty river that was supposed to flush the city's waste out to sea became a stagnant pond. Second, the heat began to cook the tons upon tons of raw sewage that had been accumulating on the riverbed for decades. This wasn't just recent waste. This was a thick, compacted sludge of historical filth, a dark legacy of the city's growth. As the water level of the torpid river dropped, it exposed vast, foul-smelling mudflats on either bank. These weren't normal mudflats. They were banks of pure, concentrated, semi-solid sewage, baking and putrefying under the summer sun. The river had, in the most literal sense, begun to ferment. The result was a stench of almost biblical proportions. This was no longer the familiar background odor of Victorian London. This was something new, something aggressive and invasive, a physical presence that settled over the city like a shroud. This was the Great Stink. To truly understand this moment, we have to try and imagine the unimaginable. The Great Stink wasn't just a smell, it was an event. It was the city's defining sensory experience for the entire summer. We are incredibly lucky that the people who lived through it were obsessive writers, diarists, and letter writers, because their words are the closest we can get to understanding the sheer horror of it. They treated the stink not as a smell, but as a malevolent character in the story of their city, an antagonist that could not be escaped. One newspaper writer described it as a nauseating smell, a pestiferous and deadly vapor. He wrote that it wasn't just one smell, but 1,000 stinks, a complex bouquet of a volatile fermentation, of a gaseous solution, of a mingling of messages from the sewer and the charnel house. A chemist who analyzed the river water at the time found that it contained, among other things, huge quantities of hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotten eggs their distinctive, sickening smell mixed with methane and ammonia. It was chemically the scent of decomposition on an industrial scale. The stink permeated everything. It seeped through keyholes and under doors. It clung to clothes, to hair, to furniture. People would wake up in the morning and find their homes filled with the foul air. The taste of it tainted their food. Charles Dickens, in his novel Little Dorrit, which was being published at the time, described the river as a deadly sewer. In the place of a fine, fresh river, life in the city began to break down. Businesses located near the river saw their customers vanish. The popular steamboat services, which were a key form of public transport, ran almost empty because passengers couldn't bear to be on the water. People walked through the streets with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or perfume pressed to their faces, a desperate and useless defense against the overwhelming stench. Sales of perfume and smelling salts skyrocketed. Quacks and charlatans did a roaring trade in anti-miasmatic tonics and powders. The true terror, however, came from the fear of what the stink would bring. Remember, everyone, from the poorest pauper to the most educated scientist, believed in the miasma theory. They believed the smell was the plague. The city held its breath, waiting for the inevitable, catastrophic outbreak of cholera that everyone felt sure was coming. Every newspaper carried panicked reports, predicting that the Great Stink would be the harbinger of an epidemic that would make all previous outbreaks look minor. The city was in the grip of a collective panic attack. Now, let's zoom in on the absolute epicenter of the drama. The one place where the political power to solve the problem was concentrated, and the one place that was, by a perfect twist of historical irony, most directly under assault by the stink itself. The Palace of Westminster, the home of the Houses of Parliament. The magnificent new building with its famous clock tower had only recently been completed. It was a symbol of Britain's power and permanence, a Gothic revival masterpiece built to last for 1,000 years. And it was situated directly on the north bank of the River Thames. For years, this had been a point of pride, offering majestic views of the water. In the summer of 1858, it became a strategic nightmare. The very men who had spent years blocking, delaying, and underfunding Bazalgette's sewer plan were now trapped in a building that was being suffocated by the direct consequences of their own inaction. The chickens, as they say, had come home to roost, and they smelled absolutely terrible. The stench in the Houses of Parliament was so overpowering that it brought the business of government to a grinding halt. The lawmakers, the most powerful men in the world's most powerful empire, were literally driven from their chambers by a bad smell. The records from that summer are almost comical in their desperation. The authorities procured huge quantities of chloride of lime, a chemical disinfectant, and spread it liberally around the building in an attempt to neutralize the odor. The Chancellor of the Exchequer ordered that the curtains on the river-facing side of the building be soaked in a solution of chloride of lime and hung in the windows, hoping to create a chemical barrier against the miasma. It didn't work. The stink was too powerful. It seeped in through the ventilation system. It rose from the drains. One member of parliament, after a committee meeting, declared that he was holding in his hand a document that had been placed near a window. In the short time of the meeting, he said, the paper had turned brown and become saturated with the smell. Nothing, he declared, was ever equal to the stench. Another MP described the atmosphere in the committee rooms as dreadful, stating that the smell was like a combination of bilge water, odors from gasworks and cesspools. The situation became so unbearable that there were serious, high-level discussions about completely abandoning London. Proposals were floated to move the entire machinery of government, parliament, the courts, the civil service, to another city like Oxford or St. Albans until the crisis passed. The Great Stink wasn't just a public health crisis anymore. It was a constitutional crisis. It had laid siege to the very seat of power. The government was, for all intents and purposes, a refugee from its own capital city. This is the moment where the story turns. For years, the sewer problem had been an abstraction for most MPs. It was something that happened to other people in other parts of the city. Now, it was personal. It was in their noses, in their throats. It was a direct, physical assault on the ruling class. The fear was no longer theoretical. They could smell their own mortality rising from the river outside their windows. And that fear finally achieved what 5 years of reasoned argument and engineering genius could not. It broke the political paralysis. The hero of this part of the story, in a strange way, is Benjamin Disraeli. At the time, Disraeli was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in a minority conservative government. He was a brilliant novelist, a famously witty and flamboyant politician, and a man who had, for years, been one of the key figures in the Treasury holding the line against the enormous cost of Bazalgette's plan. He was a fiscal hawk, deeply opposed to what he saw as profligate public spending. But in June of 1858, sitting in his office in a parliament building that stank like an open grave, Disraeli had a change of heart. He realized that the time for debate was over. The time for penny pinching was over. The situation was no longer politically tenable. The public outcry was immense. The newspapers were merciless. And the physical reality of the stink was inescapable. The government had to be seen to be doing something, and doing it immediately. What followed was one of the most remarkable and rapid political turnarounds in British history. The government, which had dithered and delayed for years, suddenly sprang into frantic action. Disraeli, the former opponent of the scheme, now became its most powerful champion. In a matter of days, he drafted and introduced a new piece of emergency legislation. The bill was simple and to the point. It granted the Metropolitan Board of Works all the authority it needed to begin construction of Bazalgette's interceptor sewer system immediately. And most importantly, it gave them the money to do it. The bill authorized the board to borrow £3 million, with the loan guaranteed by the government. The debate in the House of Commons was a spectacle. Member after member stood up, men who had previously argued passionately against the cost and scale of the project, and now spoke with the zeal of converts. They spoke of the intolerable evil and the national disgrace of the Thames. They urged the government to act with the utmost speed. The bill, which in normal times would have been debated for months, sailed through Parliament. It was introduced in late June, and by the 2nd of August, it had passed through all its stages in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and had received royal assent from Queen Victoria. The entire legislative process, which had been stalled for half a decade, was completed in just 18 days. It was a stunning victory for Joseph Bazalgette and the cause of sanitation. It was a moment when the future of London was decided, but it's a victory with a very strange and complex legacy. The decision wasn't made because the politicians suddenly had a scientific epiphany. It wasn't because they finally read John Snow's work and understood the true nature of cholera. In fact, Most of the speeches in Parliament during the 18-day panic were still filled with references to miasma and pestilential vapors. They were still operating under the wrong scientific theory. They approved the plan for three main reasons: because the smell was physically unbearable to them, because they were terrified it would cause a plague that would kill them, and because the political pressure from the public and the press had become too intense to ignore. It was a triumph of engineering and public health, but it was a triumph born from panic, self-preservation, and profound scientific ignorance. And this brings us to a really fascinating question about how history happens. Progress is supposed to be driven by enlightenment, by reason, by brave visionaries. But here we have one of the greatest leaps forward in urban civilization in human history, and it was sparked by a heat wave, a bad smell, and a government that was scared out of its wits. So this is the turning point, and it's a moment that's ripe for debate. This incredible leap forward for civilization was motivated by panic, political self-preservation, and a completely wrong scientific theory. Does that cheapen the achievement? Does it tarnish the legacy of what they built? Or does it prove that monumental progress can be sparked by even the most flawed and selfish human motivations? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this one. Let me know what you think in the comments. Whatever the motivation, the result was clear. The wall of no had been shattered. The years of frustration were over. Joseph Bazalgette had his money. He had his mandate, and now he was about to build a colossus. And so the great political battle was over. The 18-day panic of 1858 had done what years of rational argument could not. Joseph Bazalgette, after a long and bitter war of attrition against the forces of political inertia, was finally unleashed. He now had the full backing of the state, a budget of £3 million, an almost unimaginable sum at the time, and the legal authority to tear up London in the name of progress. The man who had waited so patiently in the wings now took center stage. The era of talk was over. The era of brick and iron, of sweat and steam, was about to begin. The task ahead of him was nothing short of epic: to build a new, hidden river system beneath the world's largest city, a subterranean masterpiece that would function as its savior. The start of construction in 1859 marked the beginning of one of the greatest engineering sagas of the modern age. This wasn't just a construction project. It was an act of urban warfare waged against geology, logistics, and the sheer, chaotic density of London itself. The scale of the operation is difficult to overstate. For the next decade and a half, London became a vast building site. Entire streets were closed, huge trenches were carved through ancient neighborhoods, and the city's landscape was transformed by the clatter of machinery and the shouts of thousands of workers. Bazalgette was in his element. He was no longer just a planner. He was a field marshal commanding a vast army. He oversaw every single detail with his characteristic, obsessive precision. His plan was to work from east to west, starting at the outfalls and working his way upstream, so that new sections of the sewer could be brought into use as soon as they were completed. The project was a logistical nightmare. Remember, this was an age before heavy earth-moving equipment as we know it. The vast majority of the digging for those 82 miles of massive interceptor sewers was done by hand. The men who did this backbreaking work were known as the navvies. The word is a shortened form of navigator, a term originally given to the men who dug the navigation canals of the 18th century. They were a legendary tribe of itinerant laborers, mostly English and Irish, famous for their immense physical strength, their prodigious appetite for beer and meat, and their ferociously dangerous trade. They were the shock troops of the Industrial Revolution, the men who built the railways, the bridges, and the tunnels that transformed Britain. Working in the London tunnels was some of the most difficult and perilous work imaginable. The navvies toiled in deep, dark trenches and tunnels, often working by the dim, flickering light of oil lamps. They faced the constant risk of cave-ins, of pockets of explosive methane gas released from the disturbed soil, and of sudden, lethal ruptures of old, forgotten sewer lines that could flood their worksite with a torrent of filth and water. It was brutal work, but under Bazalgette's command, it proceeded with relentless efficiency. At its peak, the project employed over 20,000 men. The material a project of this scale consumed was equally staggering. Bazalgette's specifications were exacting. He needed a material for his tunnels that was strong, durable, and, above all, resistant to the corrosive chemicals in sewage and groundwater. The material he chose would become the signature ingredient of his masterpiece, Portland cement. This was a relatively new invention, a type of hydraulic cement that was far stronger and set harder than the traditional lime mortar that had been used for centuries. Bazalgette was one of the first engineers to recognize its revolutionary potential. He set up a rigorous testing system, ensuring that every single batch of cement used on the project met his high standards. He combined this super-strong cement with over 318 million specially made bricks to create tunnels that were not just conduits, but feats of structural engineering, built to withstand the immense pressure of the earth above them for centuries. And the design of these tunnels, these hidden cathedrals of sewage, was a thing of beauty. Bazalgette insisted on a level of craftsmanship that went far beyond mere function. The brickwork inside the sewers is immaculate, with smooth, curved surfaces designed to ensure the free flow of waste and prevent any snags. The junctions where smaller sewers flowed into the main interceptors are elegant, sweeping curves, like on-ramps for a subterranean highway, designed to merge the flows without creating turbulence. He understood fluid dynamics in a way that was decades ahead of his time. When you see photographs from inside these sewers today, you aren't just looking at infrastructure. You're looking at art. But Bazalgette's genius wasn't just confined to what he built underground. As the project progressed, he saw an opportunity to solve several of London's problems at once. The construction of the main interceptor sewer on the north side of the river, the low-level sewer, required digging a massive trench right along the bank of the Thames, through the very heart of the city. Bazalgette realized that instead of just filling this trench back in, he could use it as the foundation for a grand new urban renewal project. This was the birth of the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments. The embankments were a multi-purpose miracle of engineering and city planning. First, the massive granite retaining walls of the embankments reclaimed over 50 acres of land from the muddy, stinking foreshore of the Thames, narrowing the river and increasing the speed of its flow, which helped to scour the riverbed clean. Second, hidden within the structure of the embankment, Bazalgette ran not just his main sewer line, but also a large service subway for water mains and gas pipes, and the brand new underground railway line of the District Railway, what we now know as the District Line on the London Underground. And third, on top of all this hidden infrastructure, he created broad, tree-lined public boulevards and parks, creating a magnificent new public space and a vital new traffic artery for the congested city. The Victoria Embankment, which opened in 1870, completely transformed the face of central London. It was a masterstroke of holistic design. It solved the sewage problem. It provided a route for the new underground railway. It eased road traffic, and it gave London one of its most beautiful and iconic public spaces. It was the ultimate two-for-one deal, born from the mind of an engineer who saw the interconnectedness of the city's problems. While the tunnels and embankments were being built, another key component of the system was rising in the east of London and on the marshes of Kent. Bazalgette's system was largely gravity-powered, but in some of the low-lying areas of the city, the sewage needed a little help to get to the outfalls. It needed to be lifted. For this, Bazalgette designed and built 4 massive pumping stations, and these were not just ugly, functional sheds. In keeping with his philosophy that great public work should be a source of civic pride, he commissioned magnificent, ornate buildings to house the powerful steam engines that would pump the city's waste. The undisputed jewel in the crown is the Abbey Mills pumping station in Stratford. If you were to stumble upon it without knowing what it was, you would never guess its purpose. It looks like a cathedral. It's a stunning, cross-shaped building designed in a lavish Byzantine Gothic style, with intricate brickwork, polished granite columns, and a soaring, central octagonal dome that looks like it belongs on a Russian Orthodox church. The press at the time dubbed it the Cathedral of Sewage, and the name has stuck. Inside this temple of sanitation, Bazalgette installed 8 of the most powerful steam pumping engines in the world, each one a marvel of Victorian engineering, capable of lifting millions of gallons of sewage per day. Its sister station on the south side of the river, the Crossness Pumping Station, is equally spectacular, featuring some of the most ornate and colorful decorative cast iron work ever produced in the Victorian era. Bazalgette didn't just build a sewer system, he built monuments. He understood that these works were a statement about the city itself, a testament to its wealth, its ingenuity, and its commitment to the health and well-being of its citizens. As the years went by and section by section of the massive new system came online, the effect on London was nothing short of miraculous. The project was officially opened by the Prince of Wales in 1865, though construction would continue for another 10 years. But long before it was fully completed, the results were clear. The Thames, for the first time in a generation, began to heal. The stinking black mudflats disappeared. The water, once an opaque brown soup, gradually cleared. And with the clean water, life returned. Fish species that had been absent for decades began to reappear. Salmon were caught in the Thames at Westminster for the first time in living memory. The river was no longer a symbol of death and decay. It was slowly becoming a living part of the city again. But the most profound and important legacy of Bazalgette's work was its impact on public health. It was the final, irrefutable vindication of the man who had been ignored for so long. Dr. John Snow. The great cholera epidemics, which had terrorized London for 30 years, came to a sudden and dramatic end. The final proof came in 1866. A localized but severe cholera outbreak occurred in a part of London's East End. The death toll was in the thousands. An investigation was launched, and it discovered a chilling fact. The afflicted area was one of the very few parts of London that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new interceptor sewer system. The residents there were still drinking contaminated water from the local River Lee. In the rest of London, the areas served by the new sewers, the disease was almost entirely absent. The contrast was stark and undeniable. It was a perfectly controlled experiment on a massive scale. Bazalgette's engineering had proven Snow's science. By diverting the sewage away from the city's drinking water sources, he had broken the cycle of infection. He had, without ever seeing a bacterium under a microscope, eradicated a killer. The impact on the city's health was immediate and transformative. Life expectancy in London, which had stagnated for decades, began to climb steadily. The age of epidemic cholera in the British capital was over. Bazalgette's achievement didn't just save London. It created the model for the modern city. As the news of London's success spread, engineers and city planners from all over the world came to study his system. His principles of interceptor sewers, gravity-fed flow, and downstream discharge became the gold standard. The blueprint for sanitation systems in countless cities across Europe, North America, and beyond. Paris, Boston, Hamburg, Sydney. The hidden infrastructure of many of the world's great cities owes a direct debt to the plans drawn up by Joseph Bazalgette in a dusty office in mid-Victorian London. He had invented the sanitary city, the essential foundation upon which the megacities of the 20th century would be built. But perhaps the most remarkable and most enduring part of his legacy is a testament to his incredible foresight. When Bazalgette was in the initial planning stages, he had to calculate the required diameter of the main sewer pipes. To do this, he took the most generous possible estimate of London's future population growth. He calculated the volume of waste that population would produce, and he determined the size of the pipes needed to carry it. He presented his calculations to his engineers. And then, in a moment of pure, brilliant intuition, he is said to have declared, "Well, we're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen." And with that, he ordered his engineers to take their calculations and double them. That single decision, to double the diameter of the pipes just in case, was an act of sheer genius. It cost more money. It made an already enormous project even more ambitious. But it gave the system a massive, redundant capacity. A capacity so huge that it has successfully served the city of London. A city that grew far beyond even Bazalgette's most generous projections, for over 150 years. His sewers, built with Victorian bricks and mortar, are still the backbone of London's sanitation system today. It's only now, in the 21st century, that London is finally building a new supersewer, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, to supplement Bazalgette's original masterpiece. His foresight bought the city a century and a half of time. Joseph Bazalgette was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1875 for his services to the nation. He died in 1891, a respected but never truly famous public figure. He was not a showman. His greatest works were, by their very nature, hidden from view. There are no grand statues of him in the city's main squares, but his true monument is the city of London itself. It's the silent, efficient, life-giving network that flows beneath the feet of millions of people every day. It's the hidden colossus that defeated the Great Stink, conquered cholera, and allowed the modern metropolis to be born. It's a reminder that some of history's greatest heroes are not the ones who command armies or rule empires, but the ones who, with quiet dedication and brilliant foresight, build the systems that allow the rest of us to live. And that's where the story of the Great Stink and the salvation of London comes to its dramatic close. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe to Beast History so you don't miss what's next. We've got so many more insane stories ready for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.